Hydrate.
Welcome to Sprawl Session 3, House as Crisis. To get started, I want to introduce myself. I'm Mimi Zeiger. I'm a critic and curator and visiting faculty here at SCI-Arc, and SCI-Arc is hosting us here today for this Sprawl session. I want to thank all of you for being here on this Zoom and for the folks who are tuning in on the live stream. Today, I'm joining you from Los Angeles, a geography that encompasses the traditional lands of the Tongva, the Chumash, and Kish peoples. It's simultaneously a place that Dorothy Parker once famously quipped was 72 suburbs in search of a city. And today, it's an urbanism, it's a market, it's a place in the throes of significant change. So this afternoon's Sprawl session is a partnership between Laboratory for Suburbia, based in St. Louis, and SCI-Arc here in LA. And our hope is that in bridging between these two places and in pulling into conversation a wide range of thinkers and makers who are also in a kind of constellation of places, that we can open up an even wider area of inquiry, one that addresses timely, even urgent issues of suburbanization within culture, economics, how practices of art and design might situate within and respond to these very live conditions, such as house as crisis. So I'm really excited to be joined by Gavin Kroeber, who is lead organizer for Laboratory for Suburbia, and a really stellar group of participants who will get introduced as we go. And also by the SCI-Arc students enrolled in my seminar, which I'm teaching this term, called Suburban Tendencies. And they've helped shape my thinking about suburbia over the term. And I'm proud of this group and all the SCI-Arc students who recently came together in collective action to demand accountability in the face of institutionalized power. So Gavin, I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to take us through our theme for today, which is House as Crisis, and orient us to the ebbs and flows of this Sprawl session. So why don't I turn it over to you? Welcome, Gavin.
Thanks, Mimi. And thanks everyone for being here in the Zoom room with us and the folks on the live streams. So as advertised, my name is Gavin Kroeber and I am the lead organizer for Laboratory for Suburbia. We definitely do have at least one foot firmly planted here in so-called St. Louis. The project was launched in 2020 with the art space The Luminary here and presented in partnership with Washington University's initiative, The Divided City. And I think, as Mimi was gesturing towards, it's especially exciting to partner with SCI-Arc because it gives us a chance to take our Rust Belt suburbia, our shrinking city suburbia, and crash it into, truly canon suburbia, Sun Belt, boomtown, Los Angeles. So for that and a number of other reasons, I just want to open with a big thank you to SCI-Arc for bringing this together. I'm going to hold back other credits until the very end of the session, but for one, I want to shout out Maeve Elder, curatorial assistant for Laboratory for Suburbia. I think very little of what we do would be possible without her holding the whole edifice up. So in theory, we like to dispense with as many of the formalities and introductions as we can, but I do think some framing is going to be important today, especially for folks at SCI-Arc, students who maybe this is your first rodeo with Laboratory for Suburbia or our Sprawl sessions. So let me try to lay out the basics quickly. Laboratory for Suburbia is an art and design think tank for critical suburban practice, fundamentally oriented towards what we think of as a gap in practice. a gap constituted on the one hand by an increasingly legible urgency of suburbia as a landscape of power, arguably the defining landscape of power in the United States right now. And on the other hand, a predominant, not total, but a predominant failure of art and design disciplines to engage suburban spaces. As I mentioned, this project launched in 2020, and the three signal crises of that year, the pandemic, the uprisings, and the election, they each, in their own way, pointed very urgently towards suburbanized landscapes. And yet at the same time, there are a set of, let's say, barriers to entry for artists and designers that want to operate in these spaces. Some of those are material, having to do with regimes of private property in the suburbs or the distribution of publics. Some of those are disciplinary or institutional, having to do with the ways that art worlds and design worlds are oriented towards prestige cosmopolitan sites and placemaking sites in the inner city. And some of it is really straight up ideological. There is no doubt a kind of persistent, capital R, romantic, anti-suburban bias that dictates that the suburbs are the place you leave in order to attempt visionary work. So all of those forces and conditions constitute this gap into which we try to invite artists, designers, scholars, and others to step. Laboratory for Suburbia is a creature of the pandemic, and the spine of our work to date has been online conversations. These sprawl sessions are really intended as a space to inhabit that gap. They are public exchanges, salons, really. We're not looking to seal the gap in practice. We're not looking to deliver comprehensive answers to the questions, but we want to spend time together to consider suburban conditions and, moreover, to discuss potential strategies for art and design intervention in suburban space. We really embrace the name, Sprawl. There won't be any formal presentations or slideshows, though a few images or videos may get passed around in the course of the hour. There's no strict structure. There will be no intros or reading of bios, although May will be dropping bios into the chat, starting now with a sort of overview document with info on all of today's featured participants. And we'll also drop in individual bios and links as different people speak. There's no formal Q&A, though there is a lot of knowledge in the room. And we want to recognize that a lot of people come to these conversations with a real investment in the issues. And so we want to work to bring conversation out of the chat and into the space. So feel free to drop comments and questions into the chat if you're on Zoom. Likewise, I believe the Vimeo live stream has a chat that we're also monitoring. And for those of you in the room on Zoom, there may even be moments where we can pull you in on video if that's something you'd be interested to do. Fundamentally, the balance we try to strike with these is something in between critical and casual. We want to leave some room for play. We welcome provocations and sudden pivots and detours. So with that orientation to the sprawl, let me just touch on today's topic, house as crisis. The last two sprawl sessions were focused on white suburbias and Black suburban imaginaries, respectively. Today, we are pivoting from these kind of racialized geographies towards a different critical object, the house. Of course, the house is a building block of the suburbanized landscape. It's a building block of the architectural and urban design lexicon, but it is also a freighted symbolic object, a vessel for sentiments and ideologies. And the house has been the locus of various crises. I think for many, but not all, the pandemic has absolutely been experienced within the frame of the house. We can track housing crises, at least from the 2008 foreclosure crisis up until the current crises of affordability and and bubbles. And I think arguably there are also a set of perceived crises unfolding. Maybe we could just call them transformations of family, gender, and race that all play out, that all inhabit the house. So this is to say that the house as a locus of crisis is obviously a site or maybe a material for art and design intervention, but it might also be an obstacle with too many reflexes and received ways of thinking built up around it. And if there's a central gambit for this Sprawl session, or at least a departure point, it is this. If the house is a locus of crises, do we need to begin by putting the concept of the house itself into crisis? Do we need to reimagine the house itself, shed received notions and cultural reflexes, interrogate how we think about the house, what it is, what it does, how it works, how to engage it? The language we use in the blurb for this event is, if we are trapped in the house, economically, formally, and literally under pandemic conditions, then what is an architecture of escape? We've asked each participant to consider the following prompt today. A house is not a house, but a blank. There's an overall impulse as we begin to try to defamiliarize the house. And I think each of the featured presenters today bring a lot to that impulse. But Mimi and I thought perhaps we would start with you, Keller and Patty. Maybe I can leave it to you to set the exact order. But I wonder, would the two of you be willing to get us started?
Do you have a preference? Why don't you go first?
Well, I was going to fill in the blank by saying that a house is a discriminatory banking product. From my research, starting with looking, well, not just starting there, but thinking in these terms about it as a banking product is something sort of beginning from 1934 with the FHA and the sense that the house could be a flagship industry to prop up banks during the Depression. So the creation of a long-term low-interest mortgage was the thing that was going to prop up the banks. It was going to be guaranteed by the government. And the sort of precipitate of that were apartment-sized 800 square foot dwellings that would be set out on the land to be the banking product, you know, that could be repeated and that could prop up banks, and that could secondarily provide employment, because the construction industry after agriculture was one of the biggest employers, and only after that provide housing. It wasn't, you know, and that intertwining of banking and housing starts and employment seems to continually play itself out over the 20th century until, you know, the new, you know, during the 2008 financial crisis, when those bundled mortgages created buckshot all over the world, that same banking product really, in a slightly different form, it was that. This is the last thing I'll say, but it's that same, because it was both a banking product and an economic indicator. The evening news would look at would stare at the house as something that was a cause of, you know, terrible financial crisis during one part of the broadcast, and then in another part of the broadcast would stare at the house and say, I hope we have more of these, because, you know, we need more housing starts and more housing jobs. So using this little object as both an indicator of financial exacerbating and building up the economy. Everybody just asking that little object to please behave like money again.
I think I'm going to build on that. I have an image to share, and I'll go ahead and share it. So I can see, I think we can have a lot to talk about because my statement was about a house is not a house, it's a site of violence. And that's a really broad thing to say, but I am thinking about it similarly as a commodity, the same way that you're talking about it. It's an instrument of capital accumulation and extraction, which of course, occurs at all costs. Those costs are often externalized. We could look at the climate crisis and understand exactly, how the house is, putting off for future generations to deal with, right, in terms of climate change and reliance on fossil fuels. So I think this is significant because if we understand the house as a site of violence, then it's a way of talking about the marketization of architecture. So this is how I come back to what it means for architecture. And, house is a commodity architecture. As we understand it, okay, so this moves us away from architecture that we learn about, that architecture or the house, is a home, or that it makes the fabric of the city, the housing as a public facing project. It's all about the public realm in tune with the environment. Housing as a right, the house that supports, a broad idea of a collective future. I think that's an ideal of a house. And of course, there's a cultural ideal of the home that is also, sort of sidestepped when it becomes, a market product. And that cultural idea has to do with, the house is a way to inscribe territorial histories. And I say that because I saw Dolores Hayden was on this, so I'm really excited about that. So to cite Dolores Hayden and, how a house derives meaning from relationships, thinking of inhabitation and habits and all of those experiences that I think architects think of a house or a home. And even that word home has been co-opted, right? Because it's the home building industry, which is in fact an industry that's about the kind of propagation of, the house as an economic tool for ensuring that capital is continually going to be extracted. So when another way to understand this is, I guess we could think about the way the house ensures that there's going to always be, a house like this requires labor to maintain it into the ongoing future. It keeps us relying on private provision. When we talk about McMansions, it keeps us in our own cars, moving around, sort of living in planned unit developments and under HOAs in bubbles that are sort of protecting us from the larger public of the city, right? And at the same time, there's other kind of violence in terms of the extractive, just the nature of building these things and the fact that this reproduces a system where we live in a great distance from our resources, from the energy that fuels the house, from the food that comes to us, from the water, from all of these things. So I'm looking at the house as violence from a number of scales, and also as violence to architecture itself as we know it. It's sort of like co-opted, the house as an economic instrument has now co-opted architecture. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yes, I mean, I agree with all the things that you're saying, and the morphological effects of that housing industry and the house as an economic instrument or the house as a banking product are also, continue to be so dramatic. I think there are some, probably the students that we teach don't really understand like why it looks that way, but the fact that it was made into a currency, the fact that you got blanket approvals from the FHA to do these gigantic, merchant builder suburbs did start a pattern of making these, identical dwellings and so on that would be more bankable as a result. So the other way to fill in the blank for me is contagion, because that's then suggestive of something creative for me, at least, that there's a way to look at that field of houses that's something like a cross between an agricultural field and an assembly line. And see another kind of form that architects can learn from, to look at that, what I would call a spatial product, and see the form not of shape and outline, but the form of another kind of multiplier that can perhaps become a germ within this landscape, get carried into it. Or alternatively, when one's thinking about another kind of violence that this house is doing as it encroaches on areas of flood and wildfire, like even more and more and more rapidly, to think about using something like a mortgage as a counter contagion. Not using the master's tools, not colluding with it, but short-circuiting it, unwinding it, making its approvals based no longer on the same things that mortgage approvals are based on now, but based on keyed to, indexed to environmental factors, even allowing for certain degrees of collectivity and pooling, so that mortgages might be rated not in groups so that they look identical, not in groups so that they're bundled in subprimes, but in groups that reduce collective risk. So rather than thinking of, oh, well, we'll solve all of this encroaching on the suburbs with nice grasses and, fire breaks and stuff like that, like really trying to unwind it by creating a one-to-one contagion within this field. I think it's wishful thinking, perhaps, but it's what I work on. What I work on modeling and trying to make persuasions about.
I want to drop into the chat a quote from Medium Design, from Keller's book, which sort of is talking about this rival markets. I think that these contagions that you're sort of speaking to, and maybe think about like how that idea of a kind of counter market, or a kind of way that you might push back. And I think, Keller, I really appreciate you starting to outline what some of those look like. And perhaps we could pivot maybe to Mary Ellen Carroll to sort of talk about her project, and how that is beginning to also create a kind of contagion or reevaluation, or sort of change the market of the house's subject in there, if that's okay. Unless, Patty, there was anything else that we wanted to add for the moment.
I just wanted to add,
Sure.
In addition to thinking of these sort of rival scenarios, I think there's a way to infiltrate the system itself. And that's another space of design, and design can make legible the systems that we're talking about. These contagions is a great term. And to then sort of from the inside, using those tools itself, remake the tool or the thing. So that's the way I think, and I work in my relation to this stuff also in my teaching and work. We can keep talking about it.
Well, and to jump on some things in play, one thing that this makes me think of is what is the strata in which a contagion would operate? And I know that both of you in different ways, your work allows us to think sometimes of the house as a surface effect, right? That there's a set of economic layers, policy layers that produce these particular spatial products. And in a lot of ways, it's that kind of, let's call it an undercode, into which we're talking about releasing the contagion. And I think that too might be a good moment to piggyback on Mimi's impulse to start pulling Mary Ellen in here, because Mary Ellen, you've done work that very explicitly plays in this tension between the fetishized object of the house, but also a kind of wider landscape of policy that undergirds it, and trying to sort of toggle attention between two of those. So I wonder if we, as a widening, if we could pull you in.
Yeah, please. No, thank you. Hi, everybody. Ciao from Milano, where there really aren't suburbs in Italy, as we know. I mean, there's some form, but I was very happy to hear that Dolores is with us, and Keller, that you brought up the FHA. I also wanted to bring up the VHA, right? So as we know, after World War II, with Hoover and the creation of these mechanisms of which people were able to buy homes and participate in that American dream, that there was also a political question as to what was the undergirding, the foundation of that, and to keep people occupied. And also to keep people out of the system as well, right? I mean, we know in terms of talking about that violence that occurred and who was included and who was excluded in that. And so talking about, those processes and I said that a house is a territory, right? That it's a place that is within something else always. Architecture is inherently a political act. A house, be it, in the middle of the woods, off the grid, or in a suburb, or as Prototype 180 is, which is in the center of Houston and is ongoing, is in a post-war development, but it's not a suburb. It's single family homes that were mass produced in a kind of production line after World War II, starting in the 50s by a man named Frank Sharp. Interestingly enough, I've been thinking a lot about also the infrastructure that's developed with the highway systems. I work a lot on telecommunication systems, so shifting from what's below the ground on the ground to also what's in the airwaves. And if we look at that space as well, so that's something that's I'm continually going back to, and what the policy is in regards to land use. Houston has no land use policy. Sharpstown, where Prototype 180 is, actually a policy blind spot. So what are these policy blind spots, and how then is agency created within these locations? And then when we go into the airwaves and spectrum, which is directly linked, I mean, it's one of the things that we've seen during the pandemic is how essential it is to have some form of connectivity, and how that can be done independently from Elon Musk putting up a satellite that's not really actually providing access to people in the Ukraine right now. But what are those ways in which those kinds of systems can be reconsidered, and actually retrofitting those spaces in ways where it's the users and the occupants that are the ones that are determining that use, and how it can be both just and equitable. So there's a lot, to consider. And the one thing about Prototype 180 is that it never reacts, that it's always acting. And so when you work on something for over 20 years, you end up seeing how the politics change, both locally within the area, and then equally within the city and moving on from the state and beyond. So
thank you for that. Just to pause there, I want people to know Maeve has dropped some links to Prototype's website into the chat. There was a Guardian write-up on the demolition phase of the project there, if people want to catch up. But Mary Ellen, to the degree that it's, I mean, it's such a multivalent project, but for those that aren't familiar with it, can you tell the short story version of Prototype?
that's hard for me to do in any form, but yeah, basically,
I know.
it's work that uses policy as the material, and the lack of policy in Houston that comes out of the history of land art, and then namely when architecture usurped that role. I use Frank Gehry's Bilbao as an example of that, but there's many others. And to really look at these policy considerations and what could be done. And Houston selected itself as the site because there is no land use policy there. There's no zoning. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had to say, no, there's not a little bit, there's none there. So, you know, mentioning these homeowners associations or these civic associations or the sort of self-regulation that happens, that people create because they do want to have some kind of control within these areas. And it's really the developers who started all of that. So it was a private contract. You're in a private contract. I mean, we would be engaging in tort law if something ends up coming up. And the initial, so it was started in 1999. And the first part was to have a 180-degree revolution of a single family home and its existing property. And that happened in 2010 with a number of other actions and policy, and also political events, staging mayoral forums, for example. And then in 2017, there were hurricanes. There's an anecdote that I'm not going to share right now because it would be too long, but also the way when those houses were built, structurally, they would remove parts of the material in the middle of the night to reduce the cost and their savings ultimately. So the structure was unbuilt. It was taken down in 2017. It was also hit by Hurricane Harvey. So this mention of the wildfires and all the other acts of God and that are occurring, you know, have had an impact. And before that was even taking place, though, I started to work with a group who is developing a material that uses construction debris that can be recycled to remake. So the structure will be rebuilt from itself that we ended up saving when we did the demolition. So,
you know, I always think this project is approaching a conclusion, and then there's cliffhangers and pivot.
Yeah.
Thanks for the overview there. When I open we can throw things back to, you know, Patty and Keller. I think there's a lot of, you know, shared DNA, you know, just in that triad, but also, you know, to the wider group, of course. You know, there's no script or rules, so contributions are invited from any side.
I sort of wanted to hasten to add that, you know, when talking about the kinds of exchanges that might overwhelm capital, not replace it with the superior system, because that just is reproducing the same kind of Enlightenment habit of mind that we are right now trying to shed. But thinking of overwhelming it with overwhelming the sort of automatic harm that comes from thin financial variables with the heavy stuff of proximities, of arrangements, of the kinds of stuff you're talking about, Mary Ellen. I mean, in that picture that you showed, Patty, with the sort of heavy arrangements, with the exchanges of community, with the kind of kinships and forms of commoning and pooling that are at the heart of so much of a groundswell of change that's happening now. That's part of Black feminist, indigenous, and abolitionist thinking. And that's the kind of what sort of in that quote, rival markets, maybe I would cross out that word market and just substitute exchange at this point. It's that has the potential to overwhelm that automatic harm, and the automatic harm that you refer to Mary Ellen, with the reason why it is a discriminatory banking process.
Mhm.
I think that's really beautiful idea. And I wanted to clarify, because I forgot to mention that image was an actual ad. It wasn't something I made. It's an ad that's out there for the major home building industry in the St. Louis Midwest region. And there's another version where the house is sitting on water. So we can imagine that. But Keller, to your point, it reminds me, and then I'll stop talking. It reminds me of Peter Kalmus is a climate scientist who talks about, people ask him, how can you be optimistic in this time of such, intense crisis? And he says, well, I'm optimistic because I know we haven't really tried yet.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of underlies what you're saying, which is, there is capacity to sort of, produce this groundswell of, in the face of these forces. So, okay, I'll be quiet.
I was thinking that it might be a good opportunity to bring Gustavo in to kind of take us kind of from the ground up from some of these issues, because I think we could easily kind of go kind of to the 30,000 feet, but I think trying to balance between sort of the, I see us going to infrastructure and networks and things like that, but I want to kind of come down to the ground and sort of touch base of, with kind of the reporting from the ground from Orange County with Gustavo, and sort of where these kind of overwhelming conditions are happening sort of at at ground level. And so why don't I ask Gustavo to sort of weigh in if he's feeling comfortable with that, about maybe a report from the field, if you will.
I feel completely uncomfortable because I'm not an architecture person. I'm not any of this, but I love a challenge, and I am so thrilled to be able to be here. Thank you so much. And I love the prompt, and I know exactly how to do it. So a house is not a house, it's a desmadre. And just in case you don't speak Spanish, desmadre in Mexican Spanish basically means a fuck up, a catastrophe. So a house is a desmadre in what a lot of the people who have already been talking about have shown. Discriminatory, the resources, the whole, I love the idea of just like, this is basically a front for the banks to make money. I mean, just hearing this just really makes me think about a lot of stuff. Getting the water from, at least here from Orange County, well, we don't get it from the Owens Valley like Los Angeles, but we get it from other places. Trying to figure out how to deal with where people are going to live in a place as stratified as Orange County, anywhere really in the United States, anywhere really ever. Desmadre, of catastrophe, of redlining, of discrimination, of class warfare, social warfare, all of that stuff. So in that sense, a house very much is a desmadre. But desmadre also means a party, something awesome. I'm just going to go out and party. So house I also see as a place of resilience, as a place of life. This is where we sleep. This is where we have families. This is where we have parties. This is where we park our cars in the front lawns. This is where we have, where I live, my neighbors, they'll have big, loud parties with maybe 4 or 5 genres of Latin music going from this every Saturday night from maybe 5 a.m. until 2 in the morning. So in that sense, it's a place of celebration. It's a place where you can have someone like my family. My dad was a truck driver. My mom was a tomato canner. They both came into this country. My mom came here at age 9 to pick garlic. My dad came here at age 18 in the trunk of a Chevy, and they were able to buy one of those ugly tract suburban houses, or what I would describe as a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1 swimming pool American dream. They were able to get it with 4 children. And that is just one of the many, many people. So in that sense, the desmadre is something to celebrate and something beautiful. And so a desmadre also is a challenge. So I'm hearing all this very important analysis. House is violence. House is a contagion. That's a good one, actually. That is reminds me of Malvina Reynolds' house, song Tiny Houses, and just all of that stuff, especially here in Orange County, where if you hit a certain point in the city of Dana Point, no pun intended, there's a certain hill, and all across you see these McMansions. They'll all look the same with the tiniest view of the sea. It's ugly. It is absolutely ugly. When you go to Irvine, where they allow you to paint your house any amount of 36 shades of beige, and where I once spent the night at my now wife's house, and because I was driving a 73 Cadillac Eldorado convertible, I got ticketed for supposedly parking my car there for 72 hours, even though I spent it overnight. All of this, to me, a desmadre, it's easy to trash that, but people still want that. Even right now, time where so many people are in house, so many people just cannot afford the rent. I have friends who are buying houses because they buy into that dream. They want to say, I succeeded. I have a friend who came to this country and documented, now my friend actually, and he puts on Instagram, I got my greatest house. He just, flipped this trashy, suburbanite house made into the 1940 style California ranch, is selling it for $700,000 to people like him who are undocumented. So a house is a desmadre in the sense that all of you who deal with this, not just on a theoretical basis, but also just trying to transform these systems that I agree are ultimately not just inequitable, but unsustainable from the ground level. How do you make the public at large think that way and break their addiction to the idea of the dream? Look, I'm speaking from a place. I own my house because of my savings, because I bought at the right time, right after the Great Recession, and because I'm really proud of it. I hope to be able to pay off the house in 2 years. I've obviously had it for longer than 2 years, but I view that as prideful. I view that as a pride. I don't view it as being someone who just is addicted to a horrific system, even though I know that's the case, even though I know that pulling the water and gardening my beautiful, plants and trees and all of that. And I do hate lawns. I have a little bit of lawn, just that's more for my dad. But how do you convince someone like myself that we have bought into a sham, that we have bought into something that is going to ultimately be the ruin, if not of all of us, definitely that system that has, the American system one way or another. So in that sense, a house is a desmadre, is a challenge, is a fuck up, but it's also a place of joy and pride and resistance.
I want to add something to that. I love that because I think that also it is all these things, right? It doesn't mean that it can't be one thing or the other. I mean, it's that simultaneity. And I think that also it's about being aware of it though, as well, right? It's about a kind of vigilance about interrogating these systems and these structures and even yourself of like, hey, you know what? I like this. I like being in this space. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, I think that it's about questioning and looking at it, but it's also why we're having this conversation right now, because, is it actually a crisis? Like, what is the crisis? Is it for, all of us individually? I mean, in examining it, or so I think that there's so many layers that we've started to unpack. And one thing I wanted to introduce that the equivalent of redlining is airlining. And that has to do with wireless communication and what happens. So just put that in your head and then somebody else take off from there.
Well, I just saw Justin Doro's comment in the chat. They also want a space of their own in the spirit of what Gustavo is saying. Yes, there needs to be exposure to the systemic oppression of the dream, but equally important is addressing the basis of the dream as a place of one's own, which I thought might also, I mean, Gustavo, you're ready to jump. So yeah, I'll throw the ball back to you, but I also want to tee up James, because this seems to be an obvious bridge to some of the work he's doing.
Yeah, no, just really quickly, I totally agree that that we do need to think about these things, that there's nothing wrong with it, but it's that not just the allure of the dream, but the dreaming that becomes such a narcotic that you don't even want to think for a second of all the realities around it. You willfully blind yourself to what's in front of you. I mean, I think that's really been the story of American capitalism and definitely American suburbia. But then again, the desmadre for all of us who do acknowledge sort of what we live in. And yeah, you can take pride. That's perfectly fine. But then that desmadre is, how do we get other folks to slowly start reimagining who you are? It's great and all among us on a Zoom chat, but how do I go to my sister's house who's not a total conservative, but, you know, middle of the road, and tell her, hey, by the way, like, you are a beneficiary of systemic inequity. And she's like, what are you talking about? Both our parents were immigrants. Stop with your woke bullshit. So for better, for worse. But yeah, no, James, I'm sure will talk a little bit about this, or maybe completely contradict me. So that's why we have talks.
This is like growing up in East LA and LA County in this red light neighborhood. And for me, a house is not a house, but for Latinos, it's a part of a landscape or cultural production created by memory, need, and aspirations that are rooted in indigenous and Spanish practices. So for a lot of Latinos, you know, which are probably the biggest home buyers in the country now, it's about cultural preservation. And how do you reinterpret the house? How do you reinterpret the landscape? How do you add value or change or to create a more kind of a sustainable landscape in the US? For example, a lot of Latinos, they come to the US, they buy a house in East LA or Riverside, and they miss the plaza. So suddenly their front yard becomes a plaza where they hang out at. So now we're kind of introducing social cohesion to these communities that one time didn't have any. But now Latinos come in there and say, okay, I'm going to have this land and build my culture here. And you'll see architecture that have been grown for the past centuries. They have this kind of blend of culture, and this landscape kind of create that. But I think they become places of struggle, need, and aspiration. All of a sudden, these Latinos that probably lived in a cinder block house in Mexico are building a hacienda. They can't pride. So it's really, kind of transforming how we think about these suburbs as just being these kind of block places, the places of innovation. And this is all bottom up. There isn't any Home Depot kit you can buy to Latinize your house. It just happens out of memories and aspirations. People don't know how to do this. So I think that's really the innovative part of these kind of landscapes, and how we can really kind of let people change these landscapes. And how do they, for example, might have somebody selling tamales or giving haircuts in their front yard, or having an intergenerational house of parents, or parents, and and the whole idea that these are, I think, because most housing, you think about it as being kind of transactional, because American planning is transactional. It's highest and best use. But for a lot of Latinos that come from Latin America, place is about relationships. It's kind of how do we relate to each other rather than a transaction. So we're kind of introducing this new way of thinking about land and home and community based on this kind of relationship model, not just this transactional model. I'm going to buy the starter home for 3 years and then move to Downey or something, right? But no, they'll stay in East LA and build the biggest house in the neighborhood. That makes no economic sense, but for them, that place, that relationship to the neighbors really matters. So it really puts a spin on the suburbs. And and I did my research 30 years ago looking at East LA, but now I go to Minneapolis, Boston, DC, South Carolina, and you'll see the exact same pattern. This is like the white elephant in the room that's changing the U.S. landscape, suburbs, that it's just happening, and nobody's really kind of talking about it. So that's my kind of 2 cents.
Yeah, and a lot of what James was talking about, you do see that, especially with gentrifiers, cut up your home to make it into Airbnbs. Latinos have been renting out rooms for decades. Casitas, we've been building them as long as I've known around. Pop-up or restaurants, businesses from, the whole live, work, loft thing. We've been doing that as well. So I'm going to just pull out a book. It's kind of not really with the case. It's not my object, by the way, but Mike Davis talked about this a long time ago. You really can't see it with the glare, but there's Magical Urbanism by Mike Davis, Latinos Reinventing U.S. Big City. So it's more a collection of his various essays that he did throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. But yes, Latinos have been a lot at the forefront of reimagining, especially suburbia. The city, yes, but especially suburbia. James talked about, Downey, the supposed Mexican Beverly Hills, even though I still think it's Whittier. But look at what's been going on in the Inland Empire. I would say the real Mexican Beverly Hills is, now they call it Jurupa Valley, but it's really Mariloma. So it's a suburb that still has enough land for people to be able to buy an acre of land, build their house, have their, not lawns, but build, cornfields, have places for horses and all of that. So in many senses, Latinos do buy into the idea of home ownership as the American dream. But a lot of us, once we're in it, we redefine it. And I would argue make it a far better place than what was back in the past. I mean, come on, you don't want parties on a Saturday night, like La Sonora Dinamita blasting. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
If it's okay, I wanted to just engage that because as we're in a moment of thinking about a whole wave of new infrastructure, I think a lot of us are advocating for another kind of relational support for relational infrastructure, not just an infrastructure of concrete and conduit, but a relational infrastructure which would support alternative landholding organs so that community, like incredibly vibrant communities can evacuate some of the really harmful ideas of property and work on with organs like community land trusts or other ways in which one can pool land and you can live in the house your auntie lived in, and you can suppress some of the forces of gentrification, among many other things. Community land trusts, agricultural trusts, all those things which are which you do need a little bit of help and support to do that, but that's the most prudent way to spend infrastructure money because it's like planting one seed and getting 10.
I want to pull Andrew Zago into this because I think this idea of pooling resources is critical to a project that he was working on, and maybe have you enter the discussion, both the idea of the land banking or community resources, but also as a kind of entry of the discipline into it. Like how do we design within these contexts?
Great, thank you. Yeah, and can you hear me all right? I'm in a funny room here. It's okay. Okay. I should mention, my perspective on this is not one of expertise on housing in general and the mechanisms behind it. It really comes through my work and a small handful of projects that I've had a chance to work on. When I say my work, I mean always with my partner Laura Bauman. My firm is Bauman Zago, and we've done this project that Mimi's referring to more recently, and I was thinking about a comment I think that Patty made about the reallocation of materials. One thing that was a great experience for us a couple of years ago was working with Infonavit, the Mexican federal agency that does housing financing with some experimental prototypes. And we did this house for a very small farming village called Nanacamilpa. And the model was that they would get a loan for just a few $1,000s and then would have to build it themselves. And these were, in fact, the concrete block houses that James was referring to, but a lot of times they were just built kind of off the books and had all sorts of problems. And so we worked through it. It got built as a prototype in a little assembled park, and I don't know what the fate of it is, but apparently it would be plans that you could just pick up. You could do whatever you wanted with it, which I also really liked. It was reminding us a lot of Enzo Mari's autoprogettazione, for those of you that know that, the do-it-yourself furniture from the 70s. Anyone was licensed to do it except a professional furniture maker, and could do whatever they wanted with it. But the project that Mimi is referring to, we were asked a number of years ago in the middle of the Great Recession by Barry Bergdahl at the Museum of Modern Art, together with Reinhold Martin, who was at the time at the Buell Center, to look at a failing suburb. We were one of 10 different firms, and see if we could reimagine something for it. And ours happened to be Rialto, California, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's just this side of, I'm in Chicago, it's right over there. If I'm in LA, it's just the side of San Bernardino. And it's one of these cities where on one hand, it's full of these kinds of virtually depopulated warehouses of 3 or 4 million square feet. But then all along it, it's the carpet of suburbia that expanded out from Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s and beyond, and was increasingly pushed up against wilderness, with mountain lions and all sorts of things running around the newly built suburbs. And this one failed, Rosina Ranch, and it was 2,500 homes, very, very large. And we worked, I didn't understand the mechanisms of it, but we worked with this brilliant planner and former colleague at SCI-Arc, David Bergman, who really helped us take apart the machine that puts together, it's the kind of hot money machine that has to turn over in a certain way, in a certain rate, between the speculation to entitlement to selling it to home builders and out. And all of that basically had a heart attack and the construction stopped. So we came in, and with the prompt was, with a certain amount of federal reinvestment money, could you have pointed in a different direction? And I think the thing that we were maybe most concerned with, and maybe what we thought of as our achievement, was that we thought, rather than, architects often faced with that is like, oh shit, I better just defer to the experts and then do what I can to make it sort of look better. And we decided to imagine that our let's say our diagrams and our disciplinary fictions aren't simply idle speculation, but actually could have an agency within the world and have a kind of politics. We had a long-standing interest in various tactics within architecture to observe and try to dismantle certain strong object qualities of buildings. And that's maybe a kind of longer discussion of why we would go doing, but sort of unpacking it so that buildings wouldn't have a default hegemonic quality within the landscape. One thing we've been playing with a lot is this idea of, it sounds stupid, but misregistration, like a poorly printed comic book. And we liked it because it was still legible as a whole, but qualities begin to unpack themselves. And it isn't strictly that one thing. And so after a lot of discussion with Alex Felsen, a great ecologist and landscape architect, David Bergman, others, we realized that this idea would be really important in this context, that these suburbs were a kind of monoecology in terms of landscape, in terms of financing, in terms of ownership, in terms of what's a building, what's not, in terms of the demographics, certainly, in terms of the kind of financial demographics, but also, it actually turns out in around Rialto is where a lot of, it had a growing African-American community of basically people that were able to buy out of more traditional Black neighborhoods in Los Angeles and move out there before their houses went underwater, as they said. So what we did is we just began to dismantle through a series of a kind of structured relaxation all of these qualities. So between manicured lawns and other things, there would be wilderness corridors. There would be a shifting of property ownership maps, so that as Gustavo, big fan, by the way, so honored to be on here with you.
Thank you.
I was saying people still just want that. I'd like my own house, thank you, on my own land, and I'm going to get a mortgage. And so there was that, and then next to it there could be long strands of land banks. so that people could buy into it without, without owning the land underneath, which is anyone who owns a home knows in Southern California is where most of the value is. And then also combining, houses shift into one another. So instead of, some would remain as single family homes, but lots of them had accessory buildings and duplexes and triplexes. And the thought is also, it's really amazing. What we didn't realize was, this is unlike the models that you're discussing, that you lived in that suburb when you were in a certain economic bracket. When your bracket got higher, you moved to the fancier suburb. If your bracket went down, you moved to the less expensive one. And with this model of many different properties, sometimes within it, or the name for it was coined by my colleague, Bob Solmel, property with properties, because of a kind of unpacking of the properties within it. You could potentially live in the big house and rent the little one. The wheel of fortune spins, you live in the back one and rent out the big one, and you could potentially stay there your whole life. And so it was trying to imagine, what we thought was, we were imagining a kind of architectural diagram that had a unabashedly formal quality to it, but we tried to unpack it into these other kinds of models of ownership, of financing, et cetera. And then they didn't build it, and now the suburb's completely finished, and it seems to be doing fine. So much for that. But
that rhymes well. I saw Paula dropped a comment in about some of the questions about how far people were able to go with implementation from those shows. But thank you for that. I would love to hover here for a second, sort of at this scale, the scale of, I suppose, the neighborhood, whether we think of that as a spatial product, a subdivision, a PUD, or whether we think of that as a community, or both, I guess, the bad object of the gated community. In particular, for those at the virtual table who work at that scale as planners, as urban designers, I think I would love to talk a little bit more about exactly this, the possibilities of intervention or work or shift at the scale of the development of the neighborhood. I think we began in some ways by enumerating some of the obvious challenges of this form of development. And I think it's easy to stay in that space of critique, but especially for those of you that are doing design work and planning work, I'd love to sort of hover for a bit and talk some more about not only the challenges, but what kind of possibilities are possible working at the scale of the neighborhood. Are there new or shifting modes? Are there capacities of, capacities for change when dealing not just with the house, but at that scale of an assemblage of houses?
Is that for me?
I'll also directly call out James and Patty, who I know, think at this scale and, have done studios at that level, but yeah, back to you as well.
But I will say though, and this is, relative maybe to your center there, Gavin, it did seem like most of the other people dealing with suburbs in this show thought, what's wrong with you, suburb? Why don't you grow up and become a city? And we wanted to think, and we increased quite a bit the density of it, and we understood the reasons for that, but we didn't want to villainize the suburb, just kind of alter its DNA, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think also what's interesting too is that, again, back to Latinos, is that whenever I do workshops or planning workshops about Latinos, I always have them build their favorite childhood memories, and it's always in these like family compounds, where they have 2 or 3 homes on the lot, and they play in the driveway, or they live in an apartment building and they play in the courtyard. But that's kind of where they start thinking about space or as being kind of social, and these aren't just these nuclear homes, but they're kind of like family compounds. And I spent the first years of my life living in the family compound. In Boyle Heights, we had my aunts and uncles there, and it was always people there. So it's the way you start thinking about home as a community, not just as this nuclear standalone object that you have to kind of be forced to be in, but you're kind of forced to interact with other people. And for a lot of Latinos, they find that very enduring. You know, and how do you make that part of a new kind of landscape of housing that's multi, generational and can offer you all these different kinds of elements to it?
I think there's some stuff live that is going on in California right now, whether that is State Bill 50, which is sort of bringing up ADUs, and I think we're talking about like multiple occupancies within the single family house, or State Bill 9, which is allowing for sort of multiple properties on one lot. I think all of this is sort of changing sort of what that condition of the single family house might be, that I think is getting sort of dissected here. The questions of ADUs is something that Casey and I have worked on with students, sort of through the lens of neural networks. So this is kind of a pivot, but I want to maybe throw some of these questions into the speculation of the kind of big data network, kind of sort of maybe seeing what happens when we take some of the conditions that are live right now and sort of move them into the sort of areas of prop tech or property real estate property technologies and those kinds of things. So I'm gonna take that big bunch of stuff and toss it to Casey, who's giving me a look like, oh my God, but I know he can hang with this.
Thank you, Mimi. I'm actually kind of stewing in my thoughts right now, thinking about how I need to completely rethink some of the work we're doing on housing right now, particularly after Keller's comment, and this the possibility here that I'm just being a kind of good German and exchanging one problem for another. But that I'll think about that longer after this. And I think the prompt about the house is not a house. My statement was that a house is not a house. It's a kind of material index and sensing layer as part of larger platforms who, housing tenants equitably and ethically and for cultural benefit is no longer like a primary concern. And I think Keller and Mary and Patty covered already very well the idea of the house now being a kind of placeholder for a kind of synthetic financial chip and its exchange, but also this idea that the housings are like increasingly utilized as kind of sensing layer for market, either literally through things like your Amazon Alexas, in which your day-to-day life in your house is something that is used for more targeted advertisement essentially, or even just the way that the house itself becomes an index of certain tastes and decision making for kind of speculative developers, which can be mined through platforms like Zillow and Redfin and so forth. And that I think the primary thing that we are interested in addressing is kind of recognizing these factors and trying to look at housing and the emerging typologies right now. We see like I think the ADU itself is something we've been working on. It's something I have a kind of contentious relationship to. Are these things actually desirable, or are they just symptomatic of the kind of capital concerns driving us right now? And I think that's the reality. So I think the way we've been working is trying to find ways to rethink the house, as Gustavo and James described it, and kind of re-privilege that, or finding ways to privilege that through our platforms. And I think one of the reasons it's also such a critical thing to turn to, and why, beyond the fact that we all need housing, and that certainly in LA there's a housing shortage, is just the kind of larger neighborhood scale and urban scale impacts of the kind of ubiquitous platforms that we use in day-to-day life have, in terms of, like, I would say, increasing or raising in significant your personal and domestic space. There's a great essay by Aaron Betsky, who I think I saw in the Zoom, about how essentially wayfinding apps have kind of efficiented away the kind of liminal spaces within the city, or the kind of incidental spaces within the city, and that our lives are now kind of efficiently mapped using these things between our personal space and our places where we spend money. And I think the position of the essay was more about, I think, calling into question the way that we need to start to rethink the design of the cities that we're putting out, But also, like, I think symptomatic of that is also saying that the kind of individual place of occupation is now significantly more important than it was before. And that I think that there's a lot of questions about, you know, can the house be something which is part of a community? I think when we look at a lot of the kind of smart city examples that are put in place, and they're mostly more at a high rise, but in some ways they share a lot operationally with suburbs. Like I'm thinking of the kind of Songdo master plan in Incheon, which is a kind of, you know, full bore, full tilt smart city implementation with all of the efficiencies of kind of centralized waste management and ordering and commercialization. And even though it's a dense city, like it kind of operates more like a suburb with that kind of, there is no, like, there's a public space, but no one uses it. You know, there's the kind of infrastructure to bring you goods in and out, but you basically never leave your apartment. And it's I think something that if this is going to become an imminent thing that we're going to be dealing with, driven by kind of capital and speculative development, how do we rethink the designs of these spaces to find either new forms of community building or I don't know, maybe try to preserve some of the existing ones. I think that there's a kind of marked difference, to me, at least ethically, between the kind of informal small house development and small office development that James and Gustavo were discussing, where it's about kind of building and adding the family into the property. There's, you know, it's a representative tenant ownership, versus the kind of ADU project where, you know, one of the pitches is that it still is about, you know, allowing a tenant to maintain living on their property where they move into their ADU as they retire, and then they're able to rent out their main house for income to allow them to stay in their home or property. But it's not really, right? Like it's a kind of forced economic move that you have to do if you want to have a kind of vestige or hold on something that I think, like as Gustavo was very proud of, this idea that if you own a house, you can continue to own the house, and your children can own that house in perpetuity. So I don't know, like, sorry, I'm rambling now. I was completely overwhelmed, and I'm realizing also, you know, after Keller's statement that I have to completely rethink what we're doing, because I think in a lot of ways it was looking at collective ownership models as so forth as a way of kind of holding on to an idea of a house and based on the capital pressures, but really we're just kind of swapping like one efficiency for another. Sorry.
No, it's okay, Casey. You know, one of the things that Aaron Betsky is bringing up in the chat has to do with, before we can look at interesting exceptions, can we try to understand the actual elements and attractions of the standard suburban house and development? And that makes me think of some of the work that you were doing with Zillow, and maybe thinking about how the data points that are represented in some of these like online platforms are giving a picture, or maybe a hoax urbanism picture of what the market is desiring. And I was wondering if there was anything maybe to speak to there, sort of if we were to tie in the kind of airspace kind of platforms which are regulating the kind of desirability that, you know, seems to be authentic on the ground, but actually perhaps is sort of more algorithmically derived.
Sure. I mean, I think the Hoax Urbanism project is a kind of weird one for the office, because we're not a particular. I don't do a lot of critical projects, but that one is, and it's essentially just kind of a way of envisioning the kind of data represented by these platforms as this endless fictional city that, because the house itself or the architecture itself doesn't really matter. But I think the kind of key takeaway, or I kind of glossed over it, I was rambling a bit with the platforms, is I think that there needs to be, there's something Lev Manovich has written a lot about around like Instagram, but the kind of cultural impacts of collective valuation in terms of like homogenizing, and how the platforms that valuation occurs in actually influence design and presentation and exhibition. Like with Instagram, there can be like homogenization of aesthetics in Stealthy Post, which is something he goes into a long line on, and it's specifically because like the algorithm seeks certain images get different get likes more than other images, and I think you see the same thing when you're talking about a platform like Zillow. It's operating the same way, right? Like it's the rental properties begin to represent collective data points about how you should design a home, how you should represent that home online, how that home should be priced, which is fascinating because at one level it's taking the kind of one of the things we do in our class, right, is we show the students how to build their own kind of rental prediction classifiers and cost estimators, which used to be the territory exclusively of trained professionals that did that job working for the banks typically for home appraisal and so forth. And one of the things that platform does is it allows you theoretically to kind of democratize those types of predictions or estimations. But the other thing I think it does is it realistically, like even our students, after we show them the amount of labor necessary for like an individual architect or if you're a homeowner to build one of those estimators that's actually decently robust off of this data that we're getting from there, really requires still the kind of backing of a major institution like a bank or an investment firm.
Yeah, I was wondering, I feel like this kind of question also ties into your work, Keller, and I was wondering if you wanted to get in here to sort of think about these kind of larger sort of infrastructural or networked kind of platforms and sort of where are those sort of shifting and taking us?
Well, gosh, there's so many. The kind of infrastructure that I'm working on now would be more in the realm of a protocol of sorts that would help people to, as we were saying before, kind of evacuate the idea of property and be able to share property. But I'm as Casey was talking, I'm thinking about what Silvia Federici wrote about the ways in which so often these kinds of attempts end up having this sort of intentional community feeling, rather than actually being a much more normative condition that anybody can have, as just as they could have had that 30-year mortgage. Why can they not be enabled to own things or to share things differently, scratch own? And what are the mechanisms for doing that? That I think is an infrastructure, and it's an infrastructure that would again, redouble any kinds of support that's given to it, and we could also say that there's a lot of ways in which the land is going to start to be reorganized anyway, because it's going to be underwater or it's going to be on fire. So any way that we have of thinking about how to repool land and rethink that is going to be a part of the care of other people. It is an essential kind of infrastructure. And I think it is a mistake to assume, just respectfully, it's a mistake to assume that this suburb is working. It's a mistake to assume that there is a choice of another kind of living, another kind of sharing, another kind of collectivity or commons that in which you could dwell.
And I
really appreciate. Oh, is that you, Patty?
Yeah.
So why don't you jump ahead? I think that was also a good prompt. Since his name has been invoked, to pull Aaron Betsky in from some of the chat there. But Patty, why don't we put in a stack? Why don't you jump and then I'll pull Aaron?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I'm thinking about, something Naomi Klein, I think, said, where she reminds us that the market is not going to solve the crises. Really, it's when we're talking about the ADUs and the HOAs and the PUDs and all of these things, the HOA is maybe part of the sort of private creation of these enclaves, but like the PUD and these other tools are within the public, they're within public policy. And maybe this is new for architects to think about designing public policy, but because I'm in urban design, I feel like that's what we think about. And it's a useful thing, right? To actually think that we can work in planning and we can redesign these tools themselves. So I'm just sort of thinking about, this idea of kind of making a way for localized community organizing and these kinds of things. I think it's another way of speaking to like really supporting the public, or really bringing back the idea of the public that of course has been completely gutted. Does that make sense? So we have to, but then I'm also thinking of St. Louis and with this discussion of the DNA and the suburbs. And I feel like in LA, there's like a certain suburb, but in St. Louis, like our suburbs are urban. And it just sort of like reminds you that, the suburb is an economic thing that applies everywhere in all kinds of different forms and stuff. So anyway, it was a comment in the chat, but we can come back to that.
No, I think the comment in the chat moment is perfect. So Erin, Betsky, going back a few minutes in the chat, let me pull you in because I think Keller's comments and Patty's too sort of tee us up perfectly to come back to what you were saying. And Kimberly, I saw you as well jumping in on that. So I think we're in that moment in the sprawl where we really get to throw it even wider. But Erin, I am told here that you should be able to unmute yourself and jump in.
Thank you, Gavin, and thank you for the shout out. Yeah, I've been sitting here. I'm sitting here speaking from Sprawl. We live in a subdivision, and yes, we had very little choice when we moved to Blacksburg, Virginia, which is about a 7-mile long sprawl with 30,000 inhabitants or 23,000 inhabitants, which is more and more typical, not just of the surroundings of urban areas, but also of ex-urban areas, and not just in America, but all over Europe. And I would disagree, for instance, that there's no suburbs to Milan. Milan is a huge conglomeration of suburbs, and in fact, most of the Po Valley is sprawl. And in fact, to be even more general, I would say that if you really want to understand the future of sprawl, go look at China, where they are leapfrogging over us in terms of developing ex-urban communities that have mixed use, mixed income. All the kind of things we're looking for are being developed in China in a really fascinating way. But the comment that I made was that, as in many of these discussions, I'm continually frustrated by the fact that we go directly to the root analysis of the economic situation that gave us the sprawl and continues to make the sprawl viable as an agency of continuing capitalist differentiation, oppression, and logic. But we then don't ask the question, well, why is it working? And how is it working? And yes, the point is that it's not working or is working in a very negative way for a huge amount of people. But what is a special interest there is, as we've heard earlier on, that for the people for whom it's not working, it remains an aspirational place, quite literally a place. It remains a model for not only whole groups of people, but whole countries. And it remains a manner of producing wealth, again, in a highly inequitable, highly unsustainable manner, but that continues to perpetuate itself. And I was suggesting to Gavin that actually Keith should be the person who would jump in here, because Keith is one of the few people who, coming out of that wonderful moment in Houston, the Lars Larup, Michael Bell, et cetera, Albert Pope moment, at the suburb. Let's look at what it's made up of. Let's look at its spatial configurations. Let's look at the spatial logic. Let's look at its roots, both in economic spreadsheets and in mythologies, which cannot be thought separately from each other. One of the exercises I just did with my students here, which I do periodically, is to have them start the studio by drawing where they grew up and then analyzing their spatial knowledge and their understanding of social relations based on where they grew up, which of course for 99%, in fact, in this case, all but one of the students is suburbia, and generally middle class, although with a fairly large range from McMansion to second and third generation, fairly downscale suburbs, but all with similar and related spatial conditions, material conditions, that reflect these kind of economic realities. And so my plea remains that I'm actually working with Miranda Sugars, who's a former student of Mike Bell's here at Virginia Tech, on a project to build that kind of lexicon and build that kind of knowledge that is rooted in material culture and the kind of analyses that material studies bring us to bring the kind of abstractions of ideology to the realities of it, rather than jumping to the kind of neo-utopian experiments that seem almost destined by both the economic conditions and the realities of the material elements to fail.
Let's invite folks to maybe kind of respond to that. I have folks I might want to call on, but I want to see who jumps in. Maybe I'll call on Patty, because I know that some of the work that you've been doing with your students is about indexing these components of suburbia from the kind of scale of the house and also to even down to the scale of the objects in the house. And I was wondering if you wanted to sort of weigh in there.
Yeah. So we did a studio where we kind of inventoried. I mean, we were looking at Keith's work, and we were looking at the sort of object of the suburb, the house as an object, and trying to understand it in the long line of the story of typology. So, it's called What About Typology? And it's trying to question, if we take from Moneo, this idea that typology is about the sort of continuum of the city and the house as part of building the fabric of the city, then we were trying to be informed by the market and sort of embrace that and see it as see the market as I guess just one of the other variables that's sort of, I don't know if this is making sense, but as a way to reread form through the preferences of the people buying these products. So like there's a whole chart that is put out by the real estate industry, this market tapestry, where they talk about the different buying profiles. And so if we can take that as part of the idea of the site for a single family house in the suburbs, then we can start to understand the house as designed for, it's not about what you're buying anymore. It's like how you want to live. and, you know, you need 2-car garage, and you need, you know, all of these things that are going to accommodate your stuff. And so we did a sort of whole inventory of downtown historic houses, and, you know, the buyers of those houses, and the stuff, and I guess trying to just kind of rewrite the story of typology in reference to these markets that are a part of the site. Does that make sense?
I had a,
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I had a feeling from listening to a lot of you that you all are, and I would join you in actually foregrounding the heavy stuff, the material things, the community exchanges, and so on. That is what's sort of on our plates, and often looking at those moments when there are housing crises, when the house is worth less than its mortgage and so on, when it gets abandoned, and the miraculous thing at that moment is that the house goes back to being like wood and dirt and a tree and so on, that can have, and one can then start working with its heavy values, or looking at a community like, I mean, there are suburbs all over the world. I'm thinking of one in Puerto Rico where Cano Martin Peña, where things happen. There are disasters, there are climate disasters, there are pollution and so on. And it forces the physical stuff to be the thing that is part of the exchange, and often in those moments what it allows kind of the capital part, the property part, to kind of get out of the way of what can be much richer forms of community and sharing.
I think that's a good point. I do a lot of work on community engagement with people all over the country, and it's really getting back to our core values as humans, you know, and how does that shape the built environment? I think so when we ask people to build their favorite child memories, it's always about an experience. It's always about nurturing, sharing, and caring. Nobody says, I own something. It's always about sharing, and that's what kind of develops people into human beings. But I think it's, how do we look at housing as a shared experience, as an intangible, and then how does that create the infrastructure? I think right now we think about it being infrastructure and brick and mortar, but there's a lot more intangibles that go into it that we can really kind of talk about and kind of amplify to really create different forms of housing. And I just did a workshop in Costa Mesa with Latino high school kids, and they loved apartment buildings. Their favorite child memory were living in apartment buildings. They said, we want to see more apartment buildings in Costa Mesa. So we like this whole living with other people. So I think having people kind of reflect on these really positive memories, experiences, can really shape housing in different ways.
Just one more thing. I keep thinking about, like, who owns the aesthetics of the McMansion, right? It is something that has been appropriated, and so we see its misuse all over the place, like architecture, the brick and mortar that we're talking about, that this stuff is kind of like applied everywhere liberally by non-architects. We've lost control over aesthetics in a way, because there's a suburban aesthetic in placement that's like we see in, and I'm kind of drawing from a term Brandy Summers uses. She's talks about Black aesthetic in placement, like that we find in these urban settings, with gentrification and stuff, to try to like, still market a kind of identity or something. But anyway, when we talk about the actual stuff and how do we assess it, like, I'm not sure who's in control, and I'm not sure who owns it, or if we own it. And you know what I mean by owning it, like, just kind of like, is it is it our domain? I guess it should be. And what about it, or what aspect? You know, maybe it comes back from the site-specific works, or the, you know, the California, the original suburban houses that were nestled back in the landscape.
Thanks, Patty. So I want to jump in with two thoughts here. One is to kind of underline what in some ways is maybe a sort of remedial point, but a fundamental one. And then the second is to attempt a pivot from there. So first, just to kind of underline a dynamic in play, it seems like one thing that Aaron's intervention and the responses since have opened up for us is just to underline the tension, right, between the dream, right, as Gustavo put it, and Dolores Hayden is in the audience here, the sort of idea of the triple dream of suburbia, the aspirational image, the ways that that still holds and produces sets of desires. Attention between that, the material sort of realities, the facts on the ground, the heavy objects in the house, the flows of those things, the components and how they build up a sensorium and a life world. And then the broader political and economic systems in which these things get mobilized. And I think when I called in Mary Ellen Carroll at the beginning, in some ways, the interest in Prototype 180 is precisely dealing with this dizzying toggle that the house or the suburb changes dramatically depending on which way you hold it up to the light, right? And it can feel like you're conceding too much to the market or denying too much of you know, how people use it. I just simply wanted to underline that. But there's also a question here about ways of seeing, about the aesthetic point that Patty just raised. Tim Portlock just came back. He had to jump out for a little bit, and we haven't had a chance to hear from him. And this seemed perhaps like a useful pivot to Tim, and maybe also Casey, in terms of questions of visualizing these things. Because I think in certain ways, both of you are trying to visualize crisis and trying to visualize the house, you know, both as a material object and an ideological object, and as something stuck in a system of flows. And maybe it's useful to actually talk about representation. And so Tim, I mean, maybe you could speak a little bit about how you approach this, how you took facts on the ground in 2008 and, you know, filtered them through your Cash for Gold project, or, you know, maybe more recent work makes sense. But if I may, Tim, step up on the platform.
Sure. So one of the things that I think about is when foreclosed homes are seen or when they're not seen, how they enter into the public discourse about housing. And when we hear a conversation about how great the economy is because there's construction cranes in the background, who's participating in that success. So one of the things that I did during the home foreclosure crisis was create, using Zillow, which was like new to me. Zillow had these filters that would allow you to just see where all the foreclosed homes were in a given city, is to drive around to photograph them and use that as source material. And in my own work, I would create cityscapes that were comprised of just the foreclosed homes. And so the initial idea behind my work was that within these inhabited cities, there were these uninhabited cities that, and to get the full impact of them, you had to sort of strain out all the quote unquote extraneous details. And for me, the interesting thing about the 2008 economic collapse, it was the first time, you know, in my life when I was paying attention where there was anxiety all up and down the class hierarchy. So like right now, you know, if you have a lot of money, maybe you're not as anxious about real estate. Whereas if, you know, you work at Walmart, that's something that you have concerns about. But in 2008, everybody was concerned about it. And so with my own work, because that was one of the things that inspired my work. You know, in around 2019, that was the sort of 10-year anniversary of that, and that was a time to sort of reconsider what I was doing. And I noticed, you know, consciously that's when that there had been a shift in how we think about real estate, that there was no longer that same anxiety. And so now, like if I were to, you know, put out my phrase, a house is not a home. Actually, a house is like a social model. And I think that the houses that are being constructed now is imagining a different kind of society than maybe the ones that were being constructed in 2008. But then also at the same time, I think that you know, when you tear down a house or you have an older house, that's also sort of a artifact of a different idea about how society should function. And so in my current work, those are kind of the things that I'm thinking about.
Can you share one of those images? I know you had some in your pocket earlier. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure. So this is like very new stuff. Actually, I'll go back to some of the stuff from 2009, 2008. So this is some of the stuff I was making about Las Vegas when it was the home foreclosure capital of the United States. And, you know, like I mentioned earlier, I was literally photographing houses that were in home foreclosure, or houses that were being constructed, but the construction had been frozen because the funding had dried up, basically. There's more, there, you know, other things in this series of images. One of the things that was going on in Las Vegas at the time, some of you may know about Tony Hsieh was gonna, well, the discussion then was about, among other things, the failure of the city, or the possibility that the city was going to be an obsolete thing. And so people were coming up with really interesting ideas about ways of repurposing cities. Tony Hsieh, the billionaire founder of Zappos, decided to use Las Vegas as his own personal urban experiment, and was, you know, buying up parts of it and reusing it for other things. San Bernardino became the home foreclosure capital after that. And I used also the same process to, you know, locate buildings and create cityscapes based on the foreclosed and empty and abandoned buildings in a given city. And then just sort of speed up to contemporary times, the work I'm doing now. This is work that is responding to construction cranes as the ubiquitous sort of image of most major American cities. The thing that's interesting to me is like what's going to happen now that COVID is a major factor in cities. I think it's a big question mark from talking to people who are in the building industry.
I mean, I think that was a pretty amazing sweep through at least 3 different crises, right? From 2008 foreclosure to the current bubble and affordability crisis, and straight up into the kind of pandemic question mark. What I'd like to propose here, maybe, since I'm looking at the clock, I think there's more room to go, but we are 10 minutes out from our official stop time. So I maybe want to invite a handful of final comments there, since in some ways this, that managed to cover so much ground in terms of the crises that the House sits at the locus of. As always with our sprawl sessions, we do allow them to sprawl temporally as well. We can shift into a kind of after party mode. I think there's a lot of loose threads left in place, but I think that puts us at a good point to maybe collect a few final thoughts or responses, whether that's to what Tim said or things that we haven't yet put on the table. I know, Gustavo, you have a rock, and I'm very curious about it.
Well, what do rocks do? Rocks are, in the mythological sense, they are indestructible until they are destroyed. So this is a rock actually that I painted in kindergarten that I always keep right in front of my little mock office. There's actually like a whole thing in front of me, but it reminds me of many things. It reminds me of the first house, basically the house that my parents moved into when they got married and where I grew up in until I was 10 years old. It was a small granny flat in the barrio in Anaheim, just down the street from one of the last juiceries, orange juice factories in Orange County. Orange County was not named for the orange groves. Those came later, but this place was in the middle of oranges. Also down the street from, actually I should just hold it like this, right? Also down the street from what used to be a sun-kissed packing house. When I was growing up, it was abandoned. Now that sun-kissed packing house is called the Anaheim Packing House. It's a hipster food hall. The house that I grew up in is going to be knocked down because they're going to turn it into apartments. And so I remember of those, and it was right next to an alley. Like, a lot of this in my mind is just, again, going back to the idea of the dream, because it reminds me of where I was from. It reminds me also, going back to James's point of nostalgia living in apartments. I never lived in apartments. I was my parents, for whatever reason, from the granny flat to the home, but there is nostalgia a bit for most people where they came from. For me, I have nostalgia of that place because that granny flat was in a bad neighborhood. There was a lot of abuse, not physical abuse, but just, spousal abuse in terms of verbs that I remember or words that I was talking about. So this reminds me of what I never want to go back to. And this reminds me of what my parents were able to get and where I'm at right now. And again, it's that dream. Can I break down that dream and maybe say maybe it was a little bit better because it was more of a community where I was? I guess I can, but that narcotic of the dream is strong. But at least I know that it's a narcotic. So what do I have to do to basically throw this rock into the windows of the dreams that I have and that other people's have about where we're at right now? So that's my rock.
I praise the rock. For those of you who want a rock, I will invite other folks who may have brought an object that they want to share. I know that Keller said she also had a physical thing to share. Maybe we can add that as sort of part of our concluding sort of sum ups.
This is someone mentioned Dorothy Parker before, but this is one of the places where I dwelled that was bathed in suicide light. I think that's the Dorothy Parker quote, where you went out, stumbled out into the naked sun, 60-foot setback, or a tiny little house, 60-foot roadway, 60-foot setback on the other side. I guess, it was a traffic engineered morphology in case there was a giant truck that was just barreling down and happened to go off, it wouldn't hit a house or something. I don't know, but that was the reason why I was wondering about all these things in the first place. The suicide house.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Gavin.
Go
No.
I'd like to share a picture if I can. And see if I can do that. So oh yeah, I can't. It's hard for me to share a picture, so I'll just put in the chat. Yeah, just showing just the rich details of what Latinos bring to the landscape and design. I think for me, it's like empowering Latinos to talk about where they come from. I talk to a lot of Latino architects, and they'll say they go to architecture school, a lot of self-doubt that their communities don't matter, the spaces don't matter, but having them create a language and say why that space matters, like Gustavo's neighborhood, like the whole idea of saying there's something good in this community that matters, and how do we preserve it and enhance it instead of moving out of it, how do we make it better? I think that's how we change, the suburb. Is like allowing the innovations to happen.
Here, I think I can share the image to the screen.
Okay. Yes, this is a Latino house in East LA, and it's probably built out of wooden bungalow, probably in the 1920s or teens. But there's so much design here. It's stuccoed, it has brighter windows, it has a virgin, even the tile work, the masonry work talks about, somebody's aspiration, the color, it's like the front yard plaza, basically, and it has all these details. And, Latinos are transformed houses like this all over the US now. You see this in Portland and Boston, everywhere. So it's a way to really think about how cultures really shape the suburb and what it's going to look like in the future. Might all look like this eventually. But how do we as architects start to look at these kind of designs as being kind of places of innovation and creation? Thanks.
Thank you. All right, there's a silent hover in the air, and I know a lot of people will have to jump right at 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern. So very quickly before that happens, I just want to say thank you to each and every one of the speakers today. Really loud thank you to SCI-Arc for partnering on this and hosting. A lot of gratitude to you, Mimi, for co-organizing. I'm gonna hang here on the Zoom for those that want an after party and Sprawl, but those that have to jump out, like, you are absolutely off the leash and free to roll. So thank you, one and all.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, students. Thank you, Gavin and Maeve and all our participants. I saw that there was a lot in the chat of folks going on who want to hang out, bring up some of that. We can make it a little bit even less casual, even less formal than we had. So yeah, for those who want to keep the conversation going, we can continue to just jump in